Hello, I'm Bob Daniels. Welcome to Telling Tales in ASL, from literature to literacy. We're coming to you live from the campus of Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. So glad to have you all with us. There are more than 100 sites, colleges and universities viewing us today all over the United States and Canada. We also have a live studio audience here in the Merrill Learning Center and nearby at Deaf Studies 5, across the street at the new Gallaudet University Kellogg Conference Center auditorium. Glad you're here with us. Today's program is co-sponsored by Gallaudet College National Mission Programs, the College for Continuing Education, and the Department of Television, Photography, and Educational Technology. This is great for us because many of the production people here are undergraduate students in the department. Some of them are my students as well in my English classes, so of course they want to get good grades, huh? This program is all about deaf students, our culture, and their future. Our program focuses on ASL literature. The goal is the development of literacy skills in deaf and hard of hearing children. They've been telling me a few things. They've been telling me all about literacy skills for deaf and hard of hearing students. We have a growing body of literature that is being produced by deaf persons. We have stories, we have poetry, humorous stories, and literary creations unique to ASL that provide a window into the shared perspectives, values, and wisdom of our culture. And it is a rich body of work. Here are some examples of the kinds of literary forms that we'll be discussing today. What you just saw is just a glimpse of the more to come. Let's move on with our program. I'd like to introduce Dr. Jane K. Fernandez, Vice President of Pre-College National Mission Programs. Welcome.
Thank you, Bob. What we've just seen, ASL literature, it consists of many different genres. We've just seen a few moments of them, and there are a lot more, but unfortunately we don't have a lot of time to go into great detail with all of these different genres. So because of that, we're just going to focus on a couple of different things: ABC stories and handshapes, poetry, and narrative stories. We're very proud to help sponsor today's programs because we really see it's a very important topic for the future of our young deaf people. At Pre-College National Missions Programs, one of our most important tasks is to study and promote ways that deaf children can acquire the literacy skills that they need to have in order to be successful in life. You know, in fact, last fall we broadcast a teleconference on our shared reading program. That was an excellent way to get children, both hearing and deaf, really off to the right start and appreciating the value of reading. Today we're going to make a connection between learning ASL, learning ASL literature, and the acquisition of English literacy skills. Really, more and more educators are finding that ASL literature can be used in the classroom to inspire deaf and hard of hearing students to better understand themselves and their culture. In the process, they also develop increasingly stronger levels of English literacy. For example, let's take a look at how grades 1 and 2 team from our Kendall Demonstration Elementary School use ASL literary techniques to help teach about deaf culture in English. The lead teacher is Janet Weinstock, and she's working with Francesca Renhel. These children have been studying trees and the environment, but through an integrated approach to learning, their team is integrating deaf culture with that unit. Many of you may be familiar with the timber joke. That's a classic story with a deaf theme associated with it. Let's watch.
This story begins far away in a forest. A forest with many trees. Where did this story happen? Maybe in America. There was a man who worked as a lumberjack. A lumberjack. Now, this lumberjack went to work and met his boss. Do any of you know how to spell boss? Watch. Boss is spelled B-O-S-S. The boss came out and met the lumberjack. The lumberjack asked what kind of work he was supposed to do that day. The boss said, "There are some trees over there. There are 3 trees over there, and I want you to cut them down. Later, a machine will cut up the trees and they will be taken away." The lumberjack said, "Okay, I'll do that." So, the lumberjack got his axe. The lumberjack went to the trees. He rubbed his hands together with excitement. He was excited to do his work. The first tree was a great big tall tree with a thick trunk. Well, he started chopping away at the tree. After a while, the tree started to shake with each little chop. The man yelled, "Timber!" But the tree did not fall. The man didn't know what to make of it, so he tried again, "Timber!" The tree doctor came and listened to different parts of the tree. What do you think he found out? Was the tree sick? No, nothing was wrong. This tree is deaf. The tree can't hear you when you yell timber. You have to finger spell like this. The lumberjack spelled T-I-M-B-E-R. What do you think happened? Once the children have heard the story, they retell their own favorite parts. It gives them the opportunity to demonstrate their own signing and storytelling skills. Then children prepare their own costumes for a dramatic production of Deaf Tree. Finally, the children put their knowledge of the story onto paper with words and pictures. By the end of the unit, they've learned a time-honored sign language story, related it to another unit, and applied their sign language knowledge to written language.
The title of today's program is Telling Tales in ASL, From Literature to Literacy. The videotape just shown really just shows that very process. From the teacher telling the joke to the children participating, they actually were able to participate by actually speaking the word timber at the appropriate times, and then the children would retell the joke. That way they could act it out. And then finally they were able to make that transition from the drawings to the English writing. This class is learning how to connect the signs with the written words, and the children are having fun.
Oh, in saying timber, it really gives them room for growth. I think that little girl is going to be a master storyteller, that girl that was saying timber. I'm sure that many of you are fascinated with ASL storytelling, just as I am. I'm sure you have many questions on your mind as well. We have some experts here. You've already met Dr. Jane Fernandez. I almost spelled her maiden name, Kelleher. I'm sorry. Also joining us today is Dr. Ben Bain. He's chair in the Department of Deaf Studies. He's a linguist. He also studies deaf culture and American Sign Language. Ben is also an accomplished storyteller. You'll see his work in just a few minutes.
Hi, thanks, Bob.
We're also pleased to have with us, not yet a doctor, but someone who will be, Mr. Lon Kuntz from Stanford University. He's studying there for his PhD in work that's focused on the application of ASL to deaf children's literacy development. And he'll be sharing some of his own classroom-tested techniques with us today. Very impressive.
Hello.
That was Lon that was looking at me. We're happy to have you all here with us today. We have a question that I'd like to start us all out with. What is American Sign Language literature? Ben? What is ASL Lit?
Well, I think the ASL part of the definition is pretty self-explanatory, so let's focus on the literature part. I'd like to use one of the African analysts who looked at different literary traditions, Okapio. And what he did is he looked at creative works of a variety of genre. And he explained that literature can appear basically in two forms. The first form is any form of written literature. The second is usually what's considered the oral form, or the oral tradition. So we have art that is written and art that is carried on in an oral tradition. And the oral tradition is more literally through the air and more evanescent, where the written literature tends to be a lot more permanent. American Sign Language seems to fit a lot more descriptively into the oral tradition of literature. So that's really the framework from which we need to look at American Sign Language literature. The language, the stories, and the creative forms that are created using the language in a live fashion.
If
Lon?
I can jump in here and talk about ASL literacy and tell you a little bit about what I think it means. It's a very important question. Talk about literature and literacy. Literacy, I believe, refers to the skills of knowing the language, the skills of being able to manipulate the language in different contexts, and different communicative functions. Children acquire literacy through a variety of ways. Certainly literature is one way that children can build their literacy. And also, literacy in general is developed through language and the experience of using that language. So for deaf children, acquiring literacy through two different languages, one ASL and the other is through written English, of course. Jane?
I think the tie into the classroom here is that it's very important that we expose deaf children to American Sign Language and American Sign Language literature. And they also need to be exposed to English at the same time. And that's one way that they'll be able to develop this literacy, is to have it both exposures to both languages.
Yes, that's very interesting. When we talk about literacy, we talk about access that deaf children have to ASL and to written forms, but how about the ability to read?
All right, when I say written, that includes the form of English in written form, which includes reading and writing. Bob?
Okay, call me cynical, but when I think of ASL literature, I think of someone who's quite proficient in American Sign Language. You're giving me some examples of, or can you recap what ASL literature looks like using layman's terms for people like me?
Okay. It makes sense. Of course, it's obviously the use of the language is vitally important. But also, you can't just use the language in an uncontrolled fashion. It has to be constrained. It has to be done very specifically. And of course, as stated, there's a variety of genres, as Jane had mentioned. So there's different genre, each of which has its own constraints on the use of the language. So it's really, we're talking about a creative use of the language in a very specific way. And that's what makes good literature. So we have to look, specifically in the framework of the creative use of language. And today, in this program, we're going to explain, I think, some of those ways. So please be patient. Wait till the end of the program, and you'll have your answer, Bob. I hope by the end of the program.
Ben, remember, in practice yesterday, don't be silly. Well, Lon, what do you have to say?
Another point I'd like to make is when Ben was just talking about the different forms of literature, the reading and then the expressing through ASL. Well, ASL, in terms of it being fluently used years ago, is not the same as it is today, and we want to see that revitalized. So you're looking at the character of written literature. We're seeing it now, recorded in videotape for ASL, and I think that's going to be a big help. Ben?
Okay, we could go on with this for quite a while. I think we should hold off a bit. We have some people that have some questions. We have viewers from all over the country that would like to ask some questions. If you haven't had a chance to send your questions in or collect them, I would suggest that you start collecting them and send them in via phone using the TTY or by fax. And the phone numbers are area 202-651-5904 TTY or 202-651-5906 fax or 202-651-5905. We will have question and answer periods throughout the broadcast, so if any ideas pop up, be sure and send them to us. We have experts backstage who will be reviewing your questions and selecting the ones that are of greatest relevance to our audience. We won't have time to get to every question, but we're going to save them all, and we will try to post them on a website early this summer. The name of our website is http://www.gallaudet.edu/disted/de.html. If you didn't get a chance to jot that down, we're going to show this again throughout the broadcast. Also, your participant booklet has it here on the front. I should warn you that those of you who do not sign, some of our ASL stories and poems will not be voiced. It's a bit of a problem because when you're going from one language to another, there's often a loss in translation. Captionings and voiceovers would be a distraction to the signing. I suggest you enjoy the presentations for their visual beauty and clarity. And we'll try and help by giving a brief synopsis, either before or after each story. Several weeks ago, Lon Kuntz left sunny, warm California to come to Gallaudet in midwinter to help prepare for today's program. While he was here, he met with Sandy LaRue Atuna, who is the coordinator for ASL education at the Kendall Demonstration Elementary School. They talked about how to teach ASL literacy forms in the classroom. We videotaped that discussion, and now we'll be showing you excerpts from that tape today. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of that now.
I envision 4 main objectives. First would be to foster the development of students' appreciation of American Sign Language literature. This is done through exposure to and study of the works of various skilled signers. Second would be the students' metalinguistic awareness of ASL. This is the ability to step back and examine the language that they routinely use. Third, development of the students' fluency in ASL. And fourth, we want students to have a chance to practice creating and developing their own ASL stories and poems.
Can you say any more about the students' development in ASL fluency?
The 4 main objectives that I have mentioned are all interrelated. Through the study of ASL literature, the students' metalinguistic awareness is increased. They are both exposed to ASL literature and have the opportunity to practice creating their own literary pieces. ASL literature has different genres, and each has its own distinctive features. So, if students study one genre, they begin to understand and practice using the features of that genre until all aspects of it become integrated in the student's production. This enhances the student's fluency and competency in ASL. As the students go on to different genres, their overall competency in ASL is broadened.
What are the genres of ASL? Is an ABC story an example of genre?
Yes, exactly. ABC stories may be a good place to start a discussion of ASL literature. ABC stories are unique. Deaf people are users of both ASL and written English, and ABC stories draw something from both languages. Creating an ABC story is a challenge. The order of the English alphabet letters imposes an order on the format and on the selection of possible signs to use in creating a story. The signs must be carefully selected to follow the hand shape of each letter, and once put together, it all has to be constructed to make sense and be entertaining. It is quite an art. I have a favorite example, The Haunted House by Ben Bain. I use this in class as an example of what an ABC story looks like and to show the variety of features inherent in ABC stories. Why don't we take a look at Ben's story and use that as the context for more discussion on this subject? The students were fascinated with Ben's ABC story and enjoyed it. They went on to practice it, memorize it, and perform it. I then realized that certain aspects of the story were missing. Ben's rendition was multidimensional and aesthetically pleasing. On the other hand, even though the students included all 26 signs, their renditions were flat, and they went through it quickly. So I went back to Ben's story and analyzed it to determine what was missing in the students' performance. Ben had said so much more with the 26 signs he used. Each sign carried rich meaning. They were logically constructed to be cohesive. This is a key to a good ABC story.
You mentioned the links. Can you explain more about that?
Why don't we watch the tape again? I would like to pinpoint certain segments between the letters P and Y. For example, when Ben uses the letter Q, he conveys not only the action of picking an object out of his shirt pocket, but also the action of looking down at the pocket. The letter S conveys pulling out the object and offering it. At the letter V, Ben shifts his shoulders to become the antagonist and shifts back at the letter X. So a character shift enriches a story by showing different characters while still keeping the number of signs to 26, the number of signs allowed in an ABC story. Another semantic expansion technique Ben used was inflection. For example, the letter P is used to convey the phrase, "let me see." Ben inflects the sign by adding facial expressions which in effect expands the meaning to what a fix I am in. What can I do about it? The same technique is used also with the letter X for the sign to need. It was inflected to mean that it was with urgency that something had to be done, otherwise all will be lost. So shifting the shoulders or adding facial expressions help create a cohesive ABC story. After I pinpointed different techniques that Ben used throughout his story, it dawned on the students the importance of using features such as a shoulder shift. They had overlooked such techniques. Now they were able to reproduce Ben's work. The results were beautiful.
Ben, oh, that's wonderful. It's fascinating. Creating the right hand shapes is critical for the success of an ABC story and to clear production of ASL signs in general. It's something that children should begin working on while they're very young. And it's something that we do emphasize with our Kendall School students. Jane?
Yep, that's true. And I wanted to show another example from Janet Weinstock and Francesca Rehnel's classes. Here we're going to see how they connect a variety of hand shapes to specific signs. You've got the basic hand shapes, 1, 0, 5. And they're going to connect those to specific English words. So it's also a good example of progression from ASL to the English alphabet to written English. Let's take a look at the classroom.
In our classroom, The children are introduced to the basic hand shapes for numbers, like 1 and 5, or letters, like B, A, and S, and they're encouraged to repeat and practice them. Another exercise is to color in outlines which clearly show the hand shapes to reinforce the shapes, and then connect them to a story. The sun was setting. It was night. 5 friends: Amy, Ashley, Ben, Andrew, and Alicia were riding their bikes. They rode up and down the road, up the hill and down the hill and all around. Then they noticed an owl up in a tree. It was a great big owl, and he glared at them with great big eyes. The children were all afraid. They grabbed their bikes and rode as fast as they could. Back to the house. They all rushed into the house and closed the door with great relief. Following my own telling of the story, the children demonstrate their own grasp of the story, although with some prompting from the teachers. They match their colored hand shapes to the letters on the bulletin board. Next, they turn the story into brief phrases based on the hand shapes. Finally, they write the story in English, making a final connection between their signs, the hand shapes, and the written English language.
What we've just seen is one way of introducing children to hand shapes. There are also other ways. Lon and Sandy discussed several of them during their recent consultation.
When teachers use this kind of approach, what are the benefits?
That's an excellent way to help children develop an awareness of the different properties of ASL. They are learning that signs have different hand shapes. The list of signs help children see that there are categories of signs with the same hand shapes. They notice that some hand shape categories have many signs, while others have only a few. That increases the student's understanding of the different hand shapes in ASL. Then later on, students are able to look at a group of signs made with the same hand shape and see how the configuration of the hand shape varies. Here are some examples. I have come up with a number of games which help children internalize this awareness of hand shapes. One game involves dividing the class in half. First, as a warm-up, we might focus on one hand shape, such as the 5 hand shape. The students tell me as many signs as they can think of making use of that hand shape. They might think of signs like father, mother, dear, or fine. After this warm-up activity, the class is divided into 2 teams which line up facing each other. The teams take turns thinking of signs with that hand shape as rapidly as they can. Each team takes a turn.
alternating among team members in succession. The rules of the game may vary. For example, each team may answer independently or other team members can help. The opposing team is responsible for monitoring the other team's signs to make sure that a sign has not been repeated. If they catch the other team repeating a sign, they get a point. The game continues until a team cannot come up with any more signs within the time limit. The time limit varies depending on the age of the students. The opposing team is then awarded a point. The students really enjoy this game.
It sounds like fun. I suspect you have to use different approaches with older children. Can you explain that?
That game is probably more appropriate for younger children. The older students may think they are too old for that. When I taught the unit on ABC stories, I was teaching middle school students. I gave the students an assignment where they were to come up with 5 signs for certain letters of the alphabet. I could have asked for 10 signs for those letters. The next day, the students would tell me their signs, and I would make a master list for each letter. We would then discuss the appropriateness of each sign on the list. Some students were bound to the English word that started with that letter rather than a sign for that hand shape. For example, one student gave me the word ant for the hand shape A. Actually, the sign for ant belongs to a different hand shape. This would occur often as the students became more attuned to distinctions between the two languages. The activity would continue until all letters of the alphabet were covered. A list of signs for each letter would cover the classroom walls. The students would use those lists as a resource when creating their own ABC stories. The list of signs, with what the students learned about different techniques, helped them to create these stories. They now understood what it takes to make a cohesive ABC story. The true test of their creativity came when they had to perform their story and give each other feedback on their work.
That's great. What's the end result?
Fabulous, unique. I was amazed by their creativity and what they could do. I have a sample I'd like to show you.
In these stories and others, as far as ABCs are concerned, what are the rules for ABC stories?
Well, I guess the answer to your question, Bob, has to do with the constraints on the story. For example, the story has to be cohesive. That's a really important criteria for making sense of the story. Jane, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would agree. I think there are some specific features that are required in these ABC stories. I mean, first of all, you have to have each of the letters of the alphabet incorporated, but then you also have to use cohesive devices that really expand upon those signs that you choose. There are also non-manual signals that are important, as well as inflections that are required part of the stories. Role shift is another significant part. For example, you're going to need to shift from one side to the other if you're having a discussion between a child and a mother.
Yes, I'd like to add something about the ABC story. You know that there are 26 letters in the alphabet, but with ASL, you know, we have probably over 40 some odd hand shapes. The interesting thing about the ABC story is that you can only select actually 19 hand shapes. that means you have a limitation from that number of actual handshapes that are out there. You think of 26 letters, there's really only 19 handshapes because some of them share similar handshapes, such as the G or the Q, the H and the U, you see, I and the J. So that's just some examples that it gives you an idea. There's actually only 19 distinctive handshapes that can be used.
Now it's time to hear from you. I know you have lots of questions. I've been getting those that you've been faxing in, and we have questions from people here and from the conference center. Now we have a person at the Deaf Studies Conference that would like to ask a question.
Hello, my name is Larry Fleischer, and I have one question. In the videotape with Janet Weinstock's classes, those two stories were very cute, the timber joke as well as the owl story. That was very interesting, the method, the teaching method that Janet used within that class. I would like to know exactly how does one start, progress, until you get to your final result. Perhaps Dr. Fernandez could answer that question. Are there procedures?
Okay, hello. Yes, I'd be happy to answer that question. I think especially in Janet's class, you saw the videotape showing specific handshapes that were being used. You could very clearly see the progression that was used in the classroom. First of all, there were unmarked handshapes that were used. And then the children tried to determine what specific signs could be associated with those handshapes. And then they drew color caricatures of those specific signs. And then they pasted those colored pictures underneath the actual alphabet letter. That way they could understand that the story was limited to the use of only those specific handshapes. And this allowed the children to be really a part of that learning process. One thing that really intrigued me was the way that Janet was able to introduce English words throughout this process. If you remember on the videotape, Janet asked the children, "What's the word for this specific sign?" And the children then had to respond. They had to respond by providing the English words associated with that sign. And then she had the story written in English, posted in the room. That way the children could read that story in English and then make the associations between what they were seeing signed and the actual English terminology. So that's basically the progression that can be made from ASL literature to English development. I thought it was a great process when I saw the children coloring the different pictures, and specifically that they were using different colors of crayons to represent the multiculturalism in the classroom.
I agree. That's really neat. Hope you're happy, Larry. The next question was faxed in from Brian Morris in Chantilly, Virginia. The question might be best for Ben to answer. Dealing with the sign sweat, dealing with the letter M, is that close enough? Is that permissible?
Well, that's, I think, a very, very good question. One of the challenges faced by ABC storytellers is how to deal with these 19 hand shapes. For example, M, there aren't many signs that use the hand shape M. For example, Monday comes to mind, and that's about the only one. So it's very important that you get something that's close enough in form. For example, something that would be using a bent 4 hand shape, like the sign for sweat. It's a little bit off, but it's somewhat, bending the rules, but the language does allow that. You couldn't use, for example, an N for that, because that's too far away from the target hand shape. The M is somewhat closer, so it is a little bit more permissible. For me, personally, I permit it. Maybe I'm being a little bit facetious in doing that, but I guess that's kind of the way. I think it's close enough. You can't be basically too far away. And I think your question is well taken. Yes, Lon, you want to say something?
Yes, I do. In terms of the ABC story, that's fine. But in everyday conversation, that's important to remember that you don't use that.
Yes, right. I think here we're talking about kind of a poetic license that allows you to do what you need to. Now we have a question from a member of our audience here in the studio.
Thank you, panelists. My name is Elizabeth Lucy, and I'm from Massachusetts. I'm a senior here at Gallaudet, and I have a question for any of you on the panel. You were just talking about, as we were seeing the teacher in the classroom, talking about non-marked hand shapes, the 5, the A, the 1 hand shape. But I'm wondering about the marked hand shapes. What do we do about those? So from literature to literacy, how do we make that transition with the marked hand shapes? Any comments?
I think I could take that, yes. I think as we're developing in this field, we're going to be finding more and more creative ways of teaching meta-linguistic skills to children and figuring out how children develop these meta-linguistic skills. Phonologically speaking, the unmarked hand shapes are the ones that are initially required because many signs occur with them and children get exposed to them. So like M, for example, being a very marked hand shape, that's not something that children will acquire early on. And so what you want to do is introduce the unmarked ones first. And by the time children feel comfortable with that, you can introduce the more complicated hand shapes. And I think it's a developmental process and a sequence that has to be taught.
M is a hard one, isn't it? I can't think of many that I could use with M. Well, thank you very much for your questions. We're going to have more opportunities later for more of your questions, but we have to move along. Please remember that you can still call in, fax in, or use TTY to send in your questions at the phone numbers 202-651-5904 TTY or 202-651-5906 fax or 202-651-5905. Keep those calls coming in. But for now, we'd like to move on to a new topic. One which fascinates so many of you and me as well, ASL poetry. Once again, let me remind our hearing viewers that this is an art form which is best appreciated without sound or voice. Let's rejoin Lon and Sandy as they discuss ASL poetry using several examples originally developed by renowned ASL poet Clayton Valley. Let's watch.
If people ask you what ASL poetry is, how do you describe it?
ASL poetry is created through a process of careful selection of signs that are put together in such a way that the result is beautiful and inspirational. In the ASL lexicon, we have 2 signs for poetry. One of these signs is fairly new, and it came about because of the expansion in the field of ASL poetry. As a result, the older sign now refers to poems in English, which typically make use of sounds in the way they are composed to create an aesthetic effect. ASL poetry, on the other hand, is not based on sounds but makes use of the visual properties of the language for aesthetic effect. For ASL poetry, a new and more appropriate sign was created to reflect the uniqueness of ASL poems which are visually based. Since that time, even more and creative pieces of ASL poetry have been added to this body of literature.
What is the best way to introduce ASL poetry to students? Can you give us some examples?
ASL poetry is a relatively new field. Schools are struggling with how to introduce the subject of ASL poetry and how to design the curriculum. Let's look at an example by Clayton Valley entitled The Cow and the Rooster. A lot of students have recited this poem. It is popular among children. Observe that only 3 hand shapes are used in the poem: the 5, the 3, and the Y. In that example, the 5 hand shape is used to open and close the poem, showing the size of the farm. In the body of the poem, the 3 and the Y hand shapes are used, with the 3 hand shape denoting the rooster, his cocky attitude and gait. The Y hand shape denotes the cow boasting, swishing its behind, and lying down. The signs are balanced in an alternating sequence.
I can see how that kind of poetry would fascinate children. What are some possible follow-up activities that children can do?
There are a number of different possibilities. For example, the teacher can show a piece of poetry. After the children have watched it several times, they can try to imitate it. Once they have learned the poem, they can try to give feedback on each other's performance. Each time the teacher can identify a feature for the students to monitor, such as role shifting, facial expression, sequence of signs, and fluidity of movement. The students can have one feature at a time in mind when critiquing each other. It is important to have peer critique. Another example, the teacher can ask students to brainstorm different signs that are formed with a 5 hand shape and list those signs. The same exercise is repeated with the 3 and the Y hand shapes. Those are just some examples of follow-up activities.
Other than using specific hand shapes, can you describe any other forms of ASL poetry?
There are so many, but our time is limited. Let me show you 2 different examples. The first one is entitled Dew on Spiderweb. The signer is LMA Lentz. As you watch it, notice how she describes the dew on the spiderweb. She does it 3 times, and each time there are variation in speed and intensity. Take a look at how she does that.
First, she did it at a normal pace and lighter intensity. Then it became much heavier in intensity and rapid. The third time, it was done more slowly, like at the beginning. That's interesting.
Yes. First, she describes the web as she sees it. After taking the picture, she realizes she has no film in the camera. She becomes emotional as she recreates in her mind in fast, intense signing what she failed to capture on film. Then she stops herself, realizing that it is already captured in her mind, and tries to recreate slowly the details of the image in her mind. The poem is effective because a person can identify with the experience.
Great. Can you give us another example?
I have another one entitled Set and Smile. This is also by Clayton Valley, I think many students will identify with this poem. It recounts experiences they know all too well, sitting with a large group of hearing people and hungering to know what they are all talking about. Students relate to this experience. The power is more in what is said than how it is constructed. However, it still has rhythm and is poetically structured. The same experience is repeated at different places in the poem. The experience in each place is repeated as the poet tries to imagine how she would have responded differently in each place. The poem is balanced. The shifting perspectives are patterned.
Can you give us an example of a lesson plan which would help students produce their own poetry?
Yes, one approach focuses on hand shapes. The student is to choose only one hand shape, or possibly a few, to use throughout the poem. It is better to select hand shapes that have many signs associated with them, such as A, B, C, 1, 0, and 5. This is a fairly easy list to remember. These are the most frequently occurring signs in ASL. I have an example done by a former student of mine. She uses only signs that had the hand shape 1 to create her poem. She uses signs like friend, meet, and talk.
How cute. I love the way that little girl is telling the story about the explicit descriptions of the animals. Gosh, I'm no poet. I I have to admit, as an English instructor, I think a lot about English poetry, but Lon, can you tell me how ASL poetry differs from English poetry?
All right. Both have some similarities. Of course, they are a creative use of the language. And they use language in a crafted way. The important difference, of course, is ASL, reflects its internal features as well as English does too. They each have different characteristics. Plus, ASL is a visual modality, and English is spoken. So you see the two different modalities influence the shape of the expression. In terms of ASL poetry, it utilizes different patterns within the genre, the features, and perhaps some unexplored possibilities within the language you can see coming into influence this modality. And you can see the patterns as they are expressed there coming out of that area.
Also, I want to make some emphasis here that within English poetry, there are certain techniques like rhythm and rhyme that are necessary, but American Sign Language uses repetition of hand shapes instead. Like, for example, when they were talking about the farm in that poem. And there was another poem, oh, that's right, the one about the two friends who meet. In both of those poems, you saw hand shapes used repeatedly. I think that's a specific feature that's really a part of ASL poetry, and that's the way that we represent rhythm and rhyme in a visual language.
Another example that comes to mind, for example, in Ella Lentz's poem, when you talk about the imagery that she creates. I remember a discussion that I had with Dirksen Berman, a professor here who wrote his dissertation focusing on ASL poetry. We were talking about the attempt in ASL to create imagery through the use of language. In a variety of languages, writers and poets struggle with the imagery because the written form is incredibly limiting. But in ASL, we can take advantage of this 3D space to literally represent imagery. So art can't be flat. It must be three-dimensional. And you see how Ella does that by showing the spider web and also showing the reflection through it. So taking advantage of the space is something that ASL poets are allowed to do and can do very well, where written poets have a lot of difficulty. And in that discussion with Dirksen, I found that's one, Ella's work is a great exemplar of one of the features of ASL poetry.
I have to admit, Ben, watching you is like watching a poet. The way you sign and just describe these things, it's wonderful. We need to get back to our audience and your questions. The first question we have is faxed in from Seoul, Korea. It's from Tae-hee An. And I'll direct this to Jane. Is there a poetics of ASL?
That's an interesting question. I do believe there is a poetics to ASL. But perhaps critics of ASL poetry have not really developed a system that allows an appropriate analysis of the features of American Sign Language poetry. I see there are 5 components. The first one being a visual metaphor. And by that I'm meaning the ability to compare things that are in contrast to one another visually. Also, secondly, is the use of three-dimensional space, as Ben has just discussed, being able to use the environment in front of you in a 3D fashion to create visual pictures. And third, the use of repetition. Repetition of certain hand shapes, perhaps words or sentences, and even whole paragraphs. And then fourthly is the flow. And by that I mean that poetry is much different form than you might find used in daily conversation. And then fifthly, the technique of framing. You can clearly note that a poem has a different form from another kind of literature in the way that it's produced. And by that you'll see oftentimes there'll be certain pauses that are used throughout a poem that you wouldn't see in daily conversation. So these are the 5 components of ASL poetry.
Oh, fascinating. Now we have another question from here in the Conference Center, Deaf Studies 5.
Good afternoon. My name is Steve Cho. I am very impressed with the comments thus far. I remember growing up in Korea, many people would tell me that sign language was ugly and bad and that I should speak. Even my family members would ask me not to sign, that speaking was better and that I should function as a hearing person, and being deaf was wrong. And then now in the last number of years, I've seen ASL grow. It's being studied. It's helping me feel proud to be deaf and to use this language. I was also very excited to see Ella Mae Lentz's poem. It was beautiful. You notice the one boy who signed the ABC story? I fell in love with him. I wish I had learned this genre a long time ago. I would like to ask a question. How old should one be, or at what grade should we begin teaching deaf children these genres, such as ABC stories?
What do you think? Lon?
At what age? Well, I think instead of asking at age, it might be more appropriate to ask at what language level. As they develop the meta-linguistic abilities, knowing the marked and unmarked hand shapes and the signs that go with it, they can then go to looking at the whole area of the different signs that they can work with, and then work with ASL poetry and phonology and so forth. So we were just kind of discussing this in terms of cohesiveness and going from one hand shape to the next and how that develops. And it's a question of curriculum design and working through it step by step. And once each of these are done, I think the student would then arrive at the point of being able to do it. Experimenting in my classroom with 8th graders, different classes have different levels, but they all were able to create their own ABC stories. Now, how much earlier than 8th grade, I'm not sure, you know, but I think if you go through a progression, it works out.
So, we might start with some ABC things at younger ages, and by 8th grade, then they become quite proficient. That's interesting. Thank you. I'm in awe of these people. Next, we have a question that's been faxed in from David Michael Iacano, a student here at Gallaudet University in LN 11, a room here in the library. How important is ASL poetry in the deaf community? How does this kind of poetry improve our literature and English and vice versa?
Well, I think this is an important question, and the answer is also important. We want to think specifically about language use. And what we want to do is really challenge our use of language within these constrictions that these forms give us, forcing us to think about our language, how we produce it. Again, the meta-linguistic process, what we know about our language. And the art form itself requires a lot of meta-linguistic knowledge in order to do it appropriately. And that kind of drives the language learning and the language development. So I think it's really important to see parallel developments happen in English also. And I think that's why it's vital that we have this ASL development, where people can look at the genres, develop an appreciation for art forms in ASL that will lead to an appreciation to art forms in English. And I think that's how it really benefits our community.
Thank you, Ben. Now we have a question from someone here in our audience.
Hello, panelists. I'm Andrea Feldman, and I'm from the Maryland School for the Deaf. I'm the Curriculum Development Officer, and I have a question for Ben. In your ABC story, you used the letter K as in signed English, but I'm wondering if you could substitute a more ASL version of that.
Did I say that? Wow. Yes, I guess I did say that, didn't I? Well, that's something, again, when you're looking at the ABC stories, ABCs include borrowings from English. And if we're talking about the constraints of the ABC stories, it's one thing that we have to look at. And because these are passed down through our community, it is a part of our language in some way. And maybe kill with a K hand shape is truly originally a C sign, but what you see is we have a lot of initialized signs like family and team and group. So should we, I think we should take advantage of the lexical items that we have that have already been incorporated into the language, no matter from whence they came.
And Ben, you would probably scream if someone said kind. I know that, but Alon, what do you think?
I'm not saying let's take a wholesale approach to this idea, but I think there is a fine line in terms of sign selection. Yes, we can use the sign kill, but with the K, that's all right. But, you know, different signs are coming into the language from different areas. Some of them we can use. Some of them are just outlandish. And if we use them, that really would mess up the whole story. So we have to use judgment in that area.
I don't know why. I feel like Lon's criticizing me. We have a lot more to talk about, but we need to take a break for 10 minutes. I know you've been quite patient with us. You need a chance to stand up and stretch. During our break, we're going to be showing you some announcements and various events and services here at Gallaudet that are coming up. So while you're having your break and having your stretch, you might take a look. We'd like to warn you, and the television will also be warning you when we have 2 minutes left of your break. So you can come in and grab your chair before someone else does. Remember, we'll be starting in exactly 10 minutes, so see you in a few. Welcome back. I hope you're all ready and refreshed for our second half. Oh, the questions are really pouring in now. There's still time. We're going to have time to answer your questions. And let me show you the phone numbers once again. 202-651-5904. TTY 202-651-5906, fax, and 202-651-5905, voice. We're looking forward to your faxes and calls. Now moving on to the next part of our presentation today, ASL literary genre, the narrative story. Here's Lon and Sandy once again.
I was wondering, what other kinds of stories could you have in ASL?
That is really a broad area. Most of the stories are what I call folk narratives. Most of them are shared live, and the stories are told to an audience. Most of the stories are drawn from personal experiences that the storyteller has had as a deaf person.
Deaf people include their personal experiences in their stories. What value does that have to the teacher?
One of the most important purposes is to teach about culture, knowledge, and identity. It is an enculturation process. Through narratives, the storyteller shares group knowledge, group values, and specific skills. These are instilled in the children. Through contact and interaction with the storyteller, deaf children's identity is affirmed. Also, narratives are a good way to show the diversity of deaf people. I have several narratives I'd like you to look at. They represent the broad diversity of deaf people's experiences as conveyed through narratives.
The music was so loud that it shook the church. "Oh, my Lord," the people sang, and they clapped and sang as loud as they could, all caught up in the motion. And people were moving in time to the music. The church pews were filled, and I was just fascinated with the music and the people rocking back and forth. You know how deaf people like to look at things real carefully? Well, I'd sit there and take in every detail about the people, even the people with funny expressions. That made me giggle, but Mama was right on my case and told me that wasn't nice. So I sat back and watched all of the music and movement. Now, the preacher in a black church is the most fascinating of all preachers. He preaches and preaches and preaches. And he gets more and more excited. And the excitement builds up among the people, too. And they get happy and they'd get to shouting. Sometimes the preacher would even dance. Did you know that? Sometimes he'd even dance like James Brown. Sometimes he'd dance like MC Hammer. And all the people would move along with the rhythm. Sometimes he'd do the chicken and things would really be happening. I was excited. I saw a woman with a great big hat on, and she was moving around so much that the thing just fell off. Boy, did I laugh at that, but my mom told me again it wasn't nice to make fun of people. I minded my manners. And after a while, things started to settle down a bit, and then it would be over.
Yvonne's story is a good example of someone applying their ethnic cultural roots to show the art of the ASL narrative. What does narrative mean, Ben?
Narrative, generally speaking, talks about a story that has some kind of cohesion and cohesiveness throughout it. I mean, that's a general definition of narrative, and it's a good way to, I think we can start with that definition. Because you look at Yvonne's work, you see this narrative. Often there are life experiences included in there and a variety of things, but generally it's a cohesive piece of text.
Lon? Well, Ben, thank you very much. Related to the narrative, how would you relate that to Yvonne's story?
In Yvonne's story, I think you see a good example of a deaf view or a deaf perspective, their experience within the hearing world. Now, in this specific case, it's her deaf experience within a black culture hearing world and how she sees it, and then she has now put that into her narrative story. And that's how people, tell their stories.
We have questions coming in from our audience, and we want to make sure we have enough time to answer them. So let's start on the questions. We have one from Ogden, Utah. Peggy Clark. She says that she loves watching ASL stories, and she understands the importance of the use of various genres, but she still feels that a focus needs to be on English writing and syntax and developing vocabulary. I've seen the whole language approach work with ASL stories, and she asks if ASL emphasizes enough about written language. What do you think?
Well, I would have to say no, I don't believe that ASL stories emphasize the written English language sufficiently. I think it's the responsibility of the classroom teacher to make sure that they understand and they can use some creative tools to utilize those stories that they're using with deaf children to further develop the English language, including syntax and vocabulary for the deaf kids. So I think schools really need to develop these strategies. That way they can constantly continue to make the bridge between ASL and English. If we have a large amount of exposure in the classroom of English with the deaf children, they're certainly going to learn the language. And then we need to make the switch or the transition between English and American Sign Language so they can make that link as well.
If I may add a comment to what you just said, Jane, in terms of literacy and building it, you do it through ASL, exposing the students to ASL literature and the enjoyment of the literature of ASL and the use of the language and playing with it, creating with it, and that builds within them a broader base that leads to reading. The goal is to lead the children to reading, and by way of reading, they will then increase their English knowledge and skills and the structure of grammar and syntax and so forth. But the idea is to convince the children that reading is fun, and this is one way we do that. We push them toward getting involved with reading.
I also wanted to add an additional comment related to that question. I believe that the whole language approach, I think, really incorporates the use of American Sign Language literature in the classroom. It advocates for American Sign Language to be seen as a whole language, and English as well. So I think it shows mutual respect between both languages and the bridge that can be determined between both. I believe it's the responsibility of the schools to evaluate and determine how the actual links between those two languages can be made. How ASL, for example, can be linked right into English literacy.
That's interesting. We keep talking about deaf people. This question is sent in by Ralph Sedano from Santa Fe, New Mexico, asking if ASL literature is specific to the deaf experience only. Ben?
I don't think it is. But interestingly enough, the deaf experience itself will kind of like climb into any literature produced in ASL. It's not something that really can be gotten rid of. Because you'll see that there are some examples in the variety of forms. It's not a requirement generally, but for example, if you look at Ella Lentz's poetry and some of Valley's poetry, you really don't see a lot about the deaf experiences in some specific poems. But again, the importance of a visual-based language and a visual-based art form, you could interpret that in some way as being a representative of kind of the deaf experience.
I think that says it for all of us. The next question is from a member of our audience.
Hello, everyone. I'm excited to be here this afternoon. My name is Jules Nelson Hill, and I'm from Minnesota. My question is really for the panel, but as well for a member on the videotape, Janet Weinstock and Francisca Angel. I noticed through their storytelling and the poetry, the work they were doing with the children in the classroom, and the children were then mimicking the stories. They then used a board to label certain words and items to assist the children in improving their English language literacy. Is there any research or evidence of improving the children's English literacy through the written word?
Well, I don't know that there's any research that actually proves this, but I think what we'll need to do is wait and see what happens with our young students who are now being exposed to this. I believe that we are now building a strong foundation that children can use in order to develop English literacy skills. In the classroom, Francisco was telling a story in American Sign Language, and then she was asking the students to give English words that actually matched or mirrored those signs, and then those words were written in English. So you can see the classroom really has a focused emphasis on writing. Now, I don't think that that was a real in-depth example that shows the amount of stress and emphasis that's placed on writing in the classroom, but we really do a lot of reading and writing in the classroom throughout the entire day, and certainly English will improve as a result of that exposure. I mean, that's definite. We, of course, expect the children to be very successful.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have a faxed-in question from a student at Madonna University in Livonia, Michigan. When reading trade books to deaf students, at what age do you feel the stress should be put on the printed words? When's the right time for this? What's the difference between reading in ASL and ASL storytelling? Does that make sense? What's the difference between reading aloud in ASL and telling a story in ASL?
Well, I believe it's important to state that when you're teaching reading and the developmental process associated with that, we certainly can't attach a particular aid by saying at this certain age the child will be ready to no longer utilize pictures and now needs to transition to the use of words. I think the child will indicate that they are ready just through the kinds of interactions they have with the person who's reading the story. If somebody is reading aloud to the child and asks what a specific word is, or during the reading aloud process the child is asked what a specific word in a book is, when the child is able to respond, that's an indication that he or she is ready to move from beyond the pictures to the actual text or the English words. And at that point, more difficult books can be introduced into the learning process. I don't believe that there's a set age. I think it depends upon the individual. Now, the difference between reading books and storytelling, I believe that was the last part of that question. I guess for me, if you've got books that are written in English and a person is reading that story aloud to a child, I think that that's one form. But when you have a child maybe learning that story, memorizing that story, and being able to tell the story without the use of the book, and I think you saw that kind of thing happening in Janet's class, that's more storytelling, where the child was able to be introduced to the story through the book form and then are able to repeat the story. There are similar features that will appear, but I think the skills are a little different.
I'd like to add that in terms of the narrative storytelling, it's something you do for the sake of the story itself and how you do it in that form. When you're actually translating from a book and then telling it, that's a whole nother but important kind of skill too. It has a purpose there, though, for introducing the students to the general field of literature, the world of literature, and that makes them curious and wants them to read the book. And there's fingerspelling involved, and so there's spelling of words and all that kind of thing. You are mixing the signs and the fingerspelling, so you're exposing them to the environment of language. It's a process that you're taking them through. It's really two different genres, though, the storytelling and then the translation of a story.
Really, it's almost like the concept of children using a receptive medium and then eventually coming to the point where they start expressing language. We'll get back to your questions in a few minutes, but right now we'd like to take a look at another story. This storyteller's name is Mark Morales. His contribution is based on his Hispanic heritage. We pick up his story at a family festival.
I noticed all the kids were scrambling to get somewhere in a hurry. Where could they be going, I wondered. I got up and went over to see what all the excitement was about. It was a piñata. It's a kind of game using a colorful papier-mâché bull, and it was hooked to a rope and pulled up. There it swayed overhead, looking at us with its painted eyes while we gathered underneath. The youngest child went first. He took a long stick and began to beat clumsily at the piñata, trying to hit it, but without much luck. He kept missing it as it swayed back and forth. Other kids had their turn, and then it was up to me. I put on the blindfold. I took several swings, but I missed two. I just kept swinging. No one could figure out how to stop me. They realized that they would have to risk being hit in order to get close enough to grab me. Sure enough, my stick collided with someone and everyone had a good laugh. Other kids took their turn. One kid was really good at it. He handled the stick like a pro. He found his mark, breaking open the side of the piñata just a bit, and then with another whack, the piñata was ready to burst open. We hopped around underneath, grabbing each other in anticipation. With one last swing, the piñata spilled open, and the children fought and clawed their way to the prizes, pushing and shoving and falling on top of one another. I was right there in the middle of it, determined to get something. I just about had one precious piece of candy in my grasp when some other kids fell on top of me. Everyone laughed as we tumbled about. Grandmother and grandfather enjoyed it too, and everyone thought it was the best of times. I knew when I got older, I would always cherish that memory forever in my heart.
I love that story. I'll always cherish that. That's nice how he ended it with those signs. Let's analyze the features of Mark's story. What do you see?
You can see that Mark is an incredibly polished storyteller. And one of the things you can see here are various types of cinematography features in the story. You see close-ups, you see long shots, you see wide shots, and you see these transitions that look very much like film editing techniques. For example, when the child is holding the pole, and then you switch to the view of the actual piñata itself. So there's a cut in perspective that's very similar to techniques that are used in filmmaking. And then you see also the depiction of the child in slow motion. Again, yet another technique that's used in filmmaking that's been borrowed for ASL narrative. And I think that's one really important feature. Perhaps it's also a genre itself. I mean, I'm wondering if it's a separate subgenre of ASL narrative, this use of kind of cinematographic techniques in ASL narratives.
Oh, wow. I'm not really sure how to answer this next one. It's from Elaine White in Oklahoma City. She says that she's a deaf mother. She has 2 deaf children. And she'd like to be able to get books like Dr. Seuss that play with words and sounds, but is having trouble expressing these ideas in ASL. But she likes them because her boys like them.
Again, I understand your challenge. I often find myself, let me give you an example, like one Dr. Seuss book, for example. It's the alphabet book. It's very, very simple. But if you can in some way get the rhythm kind of going with the children, the way you're signing, you know, kind of like doing almost an ABC song in sign. That rhythm that goes along with that. And that's something that goes very naturally with fingerspelling, and something that kids really enjoy seeing without even realizing it. That there are these correlations kind of between the rhythm and the movement. It's difficult, I know. You know, green eggs and ham, for example. You know, Sam I am. You know, it's a very difficult idea to kind of translate. But, you know, maybe you can kind of fingerspell in some way. Green eggs and ham, Sam I am. Kind of using the intonation that ASL allows to kind of mimic the intonation. Again, it's a challenge that I hope you really face, and it's something that will be beneficial.
Yes, what Ben has just said. I think if I could add another important part to that, the mother with the 2 children who are very interested in the Dr. Seuss books, there's another reason, I might say, that children are interested in that. There's a lot of reasons that children like stories, and you might want to find out what their specific reason is and then build on that. That's another way, is to build on their interest in that particular story or that particular book. It might be the artwork, it might be the landscapes, it might be the details of the art and so forth.
Plus, I think the story has a lot of repetition. Green eggs and ham is one of my favorites. I do not want it in a box. I do not like it with a fox. I do not want it anywhere. That kind of repetition. Now we're going to have a question from another person at Deaf Studies 5.
Hello, my name is Brian Malskoon from Fremont. I was a little confused with Lon Kuntz talking about starting with students at 8th grade for literature. But hearing children begin with nursery rhymes when they're 3 and 4 years old, even 2 years old, and that becomes innate to them. And then the grammar of their language comes at an older age. When we think about deaf children, the emphasis has been on English so much that it's caused them confusion. Where are the deaf role models, or I should say the language role models for these children? It doesn't come to them until much later, such as Lon said, the 8th grade. But all this time has been lost before then. I believe bilingual, bicultural programs should start incorporating ASL literature, because we see among the hearing community how young children begin and then at a later stage learn the metalinguistics of their language. We should have the same for deaf children. At this point, deaf children are delayed. What do you think of that?
Well, I agree with you, Brian. Experience with language, in terms of the traditional school experience, has been their focus on English. And we look at how people learn English as a second language, and we've been bringing that into the classroom. And in terms of trying to give them experiences in English and ASL, and when they're age-appropriate ready for the metalinguistic feature of the language, then I think they're ready to benefit from the grammar, the rules, and that sort of thing. So I agree with you, Brian.
What do you have to say, Ben?
By the way, hello, Brian. And I think I'd like to add on to what Lon said. There's something about the language itself that allows you to play with it. There are rhythms and intonations in the language that can be taken advantage of. For example, the example I gave with the ABCs. These are games that can be played with children, and children really enjoy it. And nursery rhymes, for example, there's these rhythms in English, and we can create these similar types of rhythm-based or intonationally based language forms. We don't have anything that's specifically developed yet in terms of a curriculum or anything formal, but it's a challenge that we have before us today that we should take up to really try to create these forms.
I think that connects with what many teachers want to know. With curriculum development and developing various activities, it's related to this next question we have from Linda Allington from Salt Lake City Community College in Salt Lake City, Utah. She asks, I guess this would be best for you, Ben. She asks how to develop greater critical thinking skills through ASL literature.
I think, in some ways it's somewhat self-explanatory. When you're thinking about language, again, we're talking about a metalinguistic process, using language to think about language. That itself is a critical thinking skill. Now, how you structure activities to do that is another issue. But basically, the metalinguistic part of it, thinking about language, is a critical thinking skill. And I don't think I have to elaborate anymore. Lon or Jane, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I would like to add to that. I agree, and I think it's important that the deaf children develop an ability to really critically think about the structure of language. And also, I think literature gives children really an opportunity to take a real good look at whatever piece they're using, poetry or narratives, to really determine what that poetry or what that narrative really means to them, what it means about who they are, about the world around them. Were there certain things that could be learned from that, some kind of moral lesson that's being taught? So it really gives deaf children the opportunity to think critically about the world as well as themselves. Ben?
I agree, and I'd like to add on to that. When kids are, looking at English, we often ask them to think about that. And it's often a struggle for deaf children. And I don't know what the struggle is, because they don't understand the language itself, or they don't understand the concept of thinking about language. So introducing this earlier through ASL will make it easier to develop those skills in English when we're talking about characters, conflict, plot, etc. So that way the children will understand kind of the other levels of the story. So when exposed to it in English as a second language, the children will, you know, have a grasp of these concepts.
But if you want to develop good analytical skills, you have to have literacy, and that relates to our next question by Frank Moran from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. Who should model the various genres of ASL literature for children? Should they be deaf people, hearing people, younger people, older people? Those still learning ASL or those who are fluent?
A valid question. When it comes time to, to do it, I'm sure you're going to look for the best models that are within your environment or your location. It's a question we struggle with and wrestle with to try to solve, because there's not a lot of people out there that can provide good role models. Perhaps you can get some from videotapes, but you're not limited to just your deaf population only. You could take some fluent hearing signers. There's no real solid, simple answer to that question, but we're continuing to debate that question among ourselves as we progress along in this area as the field grows.
I disagree in some way. I think the answer is fairly simple. The person has to be fluent in ASL to be a model, period. I couldn't imagine, for example, having someone who had limited English skills being a literacy model for someone learning English. I couldn't imagine that. So the same thing should apply to ASL. We have to find models that are fluent, also that have storytelling skills. That's another important, and that's a different question. But I think, basically you agree, but I think the fluency is important.
All right, very interesting. All of these things tie into our next question. This is from Leandra Williams in Chicago, Illinois, asking, what is it about ASL storytelling that keeps the kids so captivated? What is this about?
Well, I'll try to answer that. I think there's a lot of things that captivate children about this storytelling. I think it's the use of facial expression and body language. Also, the general use of the body really draws the children into the stories. It's kind of as if we're bringing the story to life and bringing the children into the world of an imaginary story, and that we can be right there with them, and they can be in the world. They're actually in the world of the story. And I think that's an incredible skill, and that's what really draws children into this kind of narrative.
Yes, and following up on that comment, it reminds me of that, deaf children are no different than hearing children. If the story's good, they're fascinated. What makes ASL stories good? It's literature that's accessible to them. That language is visual. They understand the story. And they'll never turn down the opportunity to enjoy a story. I think that explains it, too.
You're right. I look back in my life going to deaf clubs. The most popular people were those who were excellent storytellers. The time would fly, and I agree. It's all about a good storyteller and a good story. And our last story is a good story. It's by Mary Maltz-Kuhn, a professor, or Dr. Mary Maltz-Kuhn, a professor of history and government. Mary's also an influential deaf community activist, and her story relates to a time period in our country's history.
This is a favorite story that has been in my family and handed down through the years. It happened during World War II when Germany invaded Poland and then again invaded Czechoslovakia. We were all watching the turmoil in Europe from a distance, but when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, that was it. We were at war. The next morning, everyone was joining the armed forces, the Marines and Air Force, and my world was truly turned upside down. We couldn't get anything. Leather was rationed for the war effort. Sugar was in shortage. Coffee was difficult to obtain. Gasoline was rationed. Everything was difficult. Even the manufacturing plants had been converted from manufacturing car parts to manufacturing tanks. We were truly living in a different world. My mother planted what was called a victory garden, which really saved a lot of money. Anytime in the grocery stores when we were able to obtain meat, we would sure purchase it as soon as we found it, because that was always difficult. It was a time when my oldest brother was married. He ended up living with a deaf couple in a nice big home. They shared everything with the exception of the laundry. You couldn't buy washer and drying machines at that time. So what he did was talk to my mom, who agreed to do his laundry for a small price. There was a friend who lived not too far away, worked at Fisher Body Plant fairly near our home, who would drop off the laundry in the morning and come back in the afternoon and pay my mom and pick it up. The arrangement was working out beautifully until one day he stopped by to have a conversation with my mom. They were chatting back and forth on a piece of paper, writing notes. He was on his way home, got in his car, and was driving past Fisher Body Plant when all of a sudden he heard someone talking to him in the back seat, someone nudging his back, and he thought, how in the world did anyone get into the car without me noticing? He was terrified, kept trying to indicate that he was deaf and couldn't hear, tried to look in the rearview mirror, couldn't see anyone. The nudging in his back continued. He was certain there was a gunman in the back. He was absolutely terrified. He noticed a police station not far away, so he zipped into the parking lot thinking he would get the police to arrest the gunman. He quickly turned and looked in the back seat where there was the family dog out for a ride in the car. All the while he was thinking it was a gunman, so he drove back home, realizing he'd only wasted a little bit of gas and some wear and tear on his tires. But that's a family story that we have enjoyed for many years.
Again, we love stories like this because we can relate to them. Having a dog nudge me in the back. Thanks, Mary. And we can also see how much life has changed in the lifetime of just one person. And that's very important. Important function of ASL literature, to pass on our traditions. Jane, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, I think the important features of that story would be Mary's really an example of living history. She's gone through numerous experiences, like during World War II. And I think that classrooms around the country could really benefit from Mary and other people like her. So it's real important to have these kinds of individuals in the classrooms. Like, for example, if a class is talking about American history and specifically World War II, it would be a wonderful opportunity to have Mary come in and talk a little bit about her experiences and her life in general, to provide that exposure to the children, a form of oral tradition, you might say, that they could benefit from. And I think one example at the very end, when she talked about that embarrassing experience where she wasted the time and wasted the gas, I think that also kind of exemplifies the lack of resources that people experienced during that time, and that made an impression on her, and I think it would make an impression on the students, much more so than reading about that story in a book or seeing it in a film. So I think it's important to invite deaf role models into the classroom. And these people don't have to be Hollywood actors or actresses, but just everyday deaf people who have gone through certain experiences. Oftentimes senior citizens and older deaf people would be more than happy to come in and share their knowledge, and it's a valuable activity to the classroom.
That ties in well with our next question. From Lenora Williams in the Gallaudet Library. How can hearing parents be encouraged to expose their deaf children to ASL literature?
You're speaking about in the home? Well, there is a growing collection of videotapes now available on the market. Those who are showing ASL poetry, ASL storytelling, these are coming along now. So that's a beginning. That's a good place to start. You could also encourage group meetings, getting hearing parents together, building relationship with the deaf community, inviting people in from the deaf community to share stories with the deaf parents. You know, we're only limited by our imagination. There's a lot we can do.
Jane?
Also, nowadays, a lot of libraries are more than willing to sponsor storytelling activities and reading aloud activities for children. If parents contact their local library and request this kind of service be provided so that deaf people can come in and share their stories, I'm sure the libraries would be more than interested. That would benefit both deaf and hearing children as well. It would give them exposure to storytelling. You know, I wanted to add another thing. There's a manual that everybody received from participating in the teleconference, and in that manual you'll find a list of resources that are available. They talk about a lot of different companies and businesses that provide videotapes and books. These are helpful resources for parents and other individuals who might want to learn more about American Sign Language literature. So I would really recommend people looking through that manual.
This next question, I don't really mean to go on, but this question is from Ralph Sedano in Santa Fe, New Mexico. His question is, could the story that was presented by Mark Morales be classified as Hispanic deaf ASL literature? How would you respond to that, Ben?
Well, before I go on, I want to say hello, Santa Fe. I have a lot of friends there, so I want to take this opportunity to say hi to them. Well, the answer is yes. I think definitely that could be done. And I think it's a great way to encourage the use of these kind of materials and the use of the minority experience and that is shown through these materials. There are still these shared themes that come through in these narratives, something that we can learn more about the deaf experience from hearing or seeing, actually, a variety of these stories from a variety of different deaf storytellers.
So again, we go back to within our community, we have a variety of experiences, and we all can relate to these stories. Now our next question is from the conference center once again.
Hi, I am Carolyn Brick from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And my question relates to those 5 or so genres that you've spoken of ASL literature, such as poetry. Excuse me for going back in time with my question, but you talked about the features in ASL poetry, such as rhythm and rhyme. You know, in English poetry, or spoken language poetry, they have various forms of poetry. Sometimes their poetry doesn't rhyme, it doesn't have rhythm. I'm wondering if within ASL poetry there could also be this same type of difference. If you could have a poem without rhythm or rhyme, but that's just more emotional. Something that shows the person's experience. Because somebody sharing their experience can be a poem in itself. The one poem we saw with the girl Sit and Smile, where finally at the end she got up and left. My sister-in-law, my husband and I often experience that in our life, and that's an emotional issue. So is that poetry?
The answer to your question. We talked about the 5 features generally. I guess what Jane had recapped those for us. We were talking about poetic features, not genres, but specifically, you know, could you just have, quote unquote, emotion only be poetry, just having poetry by emotion? Well, it's kind of like looking at E.E. Cummings' poetry, an English poet. You know, he used, in one case, he just used punctuation, and it was considered poetry. So I think that's a model we can look at. Poetry itself You know, again, we have this licensing mechanism that allows you to experiment with the forms of the language. You know, maybe a poem could just be this. That would be it. Is that a poem? Who knows?
Tying into those comments, we're not going to put anybody into a box as to what poetry is and what it isn't in ASL. Some people claim that what they do is poetry, and if the public recognizes it, then you know that increases the view of what poetry is. You know, just because an individual claims that they're doing a poem, you know, will depend rather if it's accepted or not. And once the community accepts it, then